So this is the beginning of chapter 4. And chapter 4, which is demand and supply, is perhaps the most critical chapter to understand and also perhaps the most difficult to um, understand in this very beginning. So um, we are spending 2 weeks on this chapter, and not only are we spending 2 weeks on this chapter, but because it's such a long chapter, I'm going to split it up into 3 videos. So let's just give you an overview of what we're going to have here. So in video number 1, I'm just going to talk about demand. In number 2, I'm going to talk about supply. And in number 3, I'm going to talk about what happens when we put them both together and what does it tell us. Now, a big question before we even get into this would be, why is this so important? Why is it that whenever you ask someone about um, economics, maybe the only thing they ever remember is demand and supply? And why is it that, even someone who doesn't know anything about economics usually says, oh, it's all about demand and supply? Um, well, because first, no economics class would ever not teach this part. This is probably one of the most memorable topics we'll cover in this course. Mastery of this will basically assure you that you will definitely succeed on the first exam. But as an economist, it tells us something so important. And that is, that's going to tell us, as we're going to see as we get to the last video, it's going to tell us the equilibrium price. And this is so important because what it does is it ensures that we don't have shortages or surpluses of products. It ensures that basically we get the right price, and we don't, as government officials or public policy members, don't have to say what the price should be. Rather, the market participants determine the price in a marketplace setting by engaging in buying and selling the product, as we understand through demand and supply. So when the equilibrium price is charged, then there are no shortages, meaning not enough of the product, or surpluses, meaning too much of the product is sold, which from an efficiency perspective would make someone probably pretty happy. So I don't need to repeat what is just said here. It's basically a slide saying that those two concepts are very important, and they tell us for a particular kind of market how things work. And that kind of market is a competitive market. By a competitive market, on a very simple level, we mean that there are many buyers and sellers who are all trying to buy these products. So what is a market? A market is basically for a particular good. And you've got two types of individuals that are interacting in this market. You've got buyers, the people who want the good, that's your demand side of the market. And then you've got your sellers, that's the supply side of the market. So a market is for a particular product, apples, oranges, limes, lemons, flowers, whatever. It could also be for services, educational service, legal services, car driving services, whatever, there's some service going on. And then you've got the buyers and the sellers, where the buyers represent the demand and the sellers represent the supply. There's lots of different ways to understand how markets can exist. They can be very loosely organized, very tightly organized. It can it doesn't really matter how well they are organized. What really matters is that that it's competitive enough that the equilibrium price is the price that's charged. And most of the time, what we're seeing here are competitive markets. And this is the one where the key part here is that there are many buyers and sellers. And the reason why that's so important is because what that does is it ensures that no buyer or seller is so large that they can dictate the price on their own. And what's going on in this market is an interaction process. And that interaction process is getting us the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity, the price and the quantity where the market basically settles. Now, there's one extreme example of a competitive market, and that kind of market's called a perfectly competitive market. Now, in a perfectly competitive market, all of the products are the same. So an example of that might be like an agricultural commodity like corn or pigs or um, tuna, right? It's some commodity where you don't really care whether the corn was grown in Illinois or Iowa. Corn is corn, and you use it to make other products. Just like you don't care exactly where the fish was caught, you don't care, um, you know, whether the cow, um, whether the cow was um, in Montana or Texas. Meat is meat, corn is corn, fish is fish, and there's so many buyers and sellers all buying this homogeneous, basically alike product that as a buyer, you can buy as much as you want and you don't affect the price. And the reason why the buyers can buy as much as they want and not affect the price is because there are so many other buyers. And just one buyer's actions, don't have an effect on the market. And then on the seller side, they also have no pricing power. These sellers basically are kind of stuck charging the equilibrium price. As long as they're charging an equilibrium price, they can sell as much or as little as they want, as we're going to see in this chapter. Now, we have other extreme examples of kinds of markets. And the one that probably most of you would know is on the opposite extreme of perfect competition, and that's when there's only one seller, and that's what we know of as a monopoly. So, for the most part, Hawaiian Electric is a monopoly. Spectrum Cable is a monopoly, at least for cable service that's delivered by like a cord or a wire to your house. um, UH, right? It's actually a monopoly, right? There's only one UH system. There's no rival public institution here, right? Unlike California, which has University of California and the Cal State system. Now there are other kinds of markets as well that are between. Sorry, for monopoly, the best reason why it's great to be in a monopoly is that you get to determine the price, which is um, true if you are making a medication and you have the patent. You can charge whatever you want for that drug, which is why very expensive drugs are researched for a long time, and then when they're passed, very high prices are charged to deliver those drugs because you've got to cover all those research costs, but also because you can basically charge whatever you want, because you are the only firm in town that can produce that needed pharmaceutical drug. Now, between those two extremes of no power to affect the price, as is the case in perfect competition, and the other extreme, which is monopoly is the only seller and it sets the price. The other examples are oligopolies and monopolistic competition. Which basically now gives us an extreme here. So if we put perfect competition on one end of the extreme, and let's call this a kind of a continuum of pricing power, where over on this extreme, there's zero pricing power. And the reason why there's zero pricing power is because you're one seller among bajillions and bajillions of others, and you all sell the exact same product. If I were to try to charge $1,000 more for my product, and it looks just like yours, the one you're selling, because it's perfect competition, everyone's product is the same, no one will buy from me because I'm charging a higher price. And I, if it's perfect competition and it's a competitive market that is more fair than not, um, you basically would have to, um, try to find a way to restrict people from doing something in order to charge a price higher than the equilibrium price. On the opposite end of the extreme, again, we have the monopoly. And on that, we have total pricing power. You can do whatever you want under a monopoly in terms of charging the price. Over here, we'd have the oligopoly. This is when you have like 5 to 8 firms, like the airlines, like the car manufacturers. Um, there's not a lot of competition, but those 5 to 8 firms are going to act very competitively with one another. And that gives them then some pricing power. Not total, right? I mean, not total pricing power. If we were to go back to the airlines, right? Imagine some very, very small airport or just American Airlines flies to it. Well, that would be then a monopoly. And under the rules in the US society, American Airlines can charge whatever it wants to fly someone from that very small airport. But let's say that there are 3 airlines that fly into the airport: American, United, and Delta. Then if that's the case, those firms are going to have some pricing power, but they can't charge whatever they want, because at some point people will just go back to using one of the other airlines, even if they have a favorite. So with the monopolistic competition, the, the the fourth and final one, there's even less pricing power. Now, it contains 2 terms here: monopolistic competition, right? Taking from here and taking from here. Monopolistically competitive markets are quite competitive, but the products sold are each slightly different from each other, right? So if we think of like the soft drink industry, and more specifically colas, what we know is that, right, I've got Coke, I've got Pepsi, but then we have lots of other little competitors that sell almost the same, and some would argue even superior, options for those who drink cola. But you can't just charge whatever you want, because your product is only slightly different than someone else's, right? So for the most part, someone who drinks Coke would probably also drink Pepsi. And so Coke can kind of set its price because there is only one Coke. But most people I know aren't like so hardcore, like I only drink Coke and that's the only thing I drink. Most of the time, people should be willing to drink other things. And if to the extent that they are, it makes the markets more competitive. So again, the net result is that they have even less pricing power. Now, let's get into demand. Um, when we talk about demand, we need to distinguish quantity demanded from the law of demand and the demand curve itself. I'm going to come back to this slide here. But let's draw out a market. Any market you ever have to graph will look like this. What you need to add to this is the name of the market. What is being sold? Is it oranges? Is it paper clips? What is it that's being sold? Now let's go with paper clips. So this then would become the quantity of paper clips. This would be the price of paper clips. Right, and it's going to start at 0. It's going to go 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. Now, demand. It's a function. And that function tells us my willingness and ability to buy the good at a particular price. So what that would mean is that when the price is $6, I'm willing to buy only 1,000 paper clips. As opposed to when the price is $1, I'm willing to buy, let's say, 5,000. Because the price is so low, $1, I, as a consumer, then say, you know what? I'm just going to really start using paper clips for everything and anything. I'm not going to buy rubber bands anymore to close the bread. I'm just going to fold the bread bag over and put a paper clip in there because the paper clips are so cheap. So we would connect the dots. And that demand function is going to tell me that when a certain price is charged, I'm going to buy this much. So you go from price to quantity. The price drives the quantity. The price determines how much I will buy of the paper clips. When it's 6, I don't buy very much. When it's 1, I buy a lot. So on and so forth. Let's go back to the previous slide. Now, what the function is telling us, the demand function is telling us, is the quantity demanded. But now within that curve, there's also the law of demand. It basically tells us that almost all demand curves are downward sloping. What does that mean? That means that when the price goes up, the quantity goes down. The quantity demanded goes down. When the price goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. Just because I'm going to be using this quite a bit here, let me add something here. When I say quantity demanded, I'm typically going to write it out like that. Quantity demanded, Q subscript D. It's going to be determined mathematically through the demand function. And it is each point on the demand curve. These two terms I'm underlining in yellow are not the same thing. Let's call this number 1. Let's call this number 2. Let's see how they look. Number 1, which is basically quantity demanded, that's a quantity demanded point. because we do get a quantity out of it. To get that quantity, now the certain price has to be charged. The demand curve is the entire function, which contains a finitely large number of points. Again, the law of demand only tells us that the demand curve is typically downward sloping. Why does demand slope downward? And the reason why it slopes downward part of it is our law of demand, which again says as price goes up, quantity demanded falls. If price falls, quantity demanded goes up. These are driving each other. But also what it forces us to do here as well is that when we're talking about the demand curve, we need to now not only describe it graphically, we also can draw a table to understand this. And not only can we look at the market for the product as a whole and consider all individuals who buy or sell that product, but we can also do it for an individual. And you can then add up those individuals to equal the entire society. I guess as long as you find enough individuals. So here we go. I'm going to pause it here so you can kind of just read this, and then we'll pick it up from there. Okay, going back to this picture here. So what we're seeing here is both the demand curve and the demand schedule. This is the schedule. Now what this is doing is basically connecting all the points on that graph. So as you see here, at the price of 3, 6 cones are demanded. These are all called, each of these points are all called quantity demanded points. And the entire curve is called demand curve. It says right here. The schedule, what it does is it connects prices to quantity. So at the price of 3, 6 are demanded. At the price of 3, 6 is demanded. As the price falls, there's an increase in the quantity demanded. That is our law of demand, which basically says holding everything else constant. As the price falls, so we're starting here with the price. As the price falls, the quantity demanded increases. If we're here at the price of 2, now 8 cones. As we move from A to B, the price falls, quantity demanded increases, and this is a movement along the curve. In other words, the law of demand explains movements along the curve. It explains the downward sloping nature of this curve. It's explaining movement along the curve. The law of demand is explaining the movement from A to B. Now, a very simple thing to break down here as well is that we have both a market demand curve, which would be the sum of all of the individuals that are buying that same product. And then we've also got individuals that would be buying their good. They would just have a regular demand curve. But when we add up all those individual demand curves, we get a market demand curve. And you can see this kind of thing going on right here, right? If we have Catherine and Nicholas, we add up Catherine's demand for the product at the price of 2 to Nicholas's, so 8 plus 5 equals 13. 4 plus 3 equals 7. So all that you're doing is adding up each of these individuals horizontally. If you wanted to look at that same thing graphically, basically you would say that at the price of $4, that Catherine buys 4. At the price of $4, Nicholas buys 3. 4 plus 3 equals 7. So we add up the quantities, and now we're at the price of 4. So we're not adding up the prices because we're just saying at the price of 4, Catherine buys 3. Or sorry, Catherine buys 4. At the price of 4, Nicholas buys 3. 4 plus 3 is 7. Now, there's a difference between moving along the curve and shifting the curve. When we say that demand has shifted, that means that the curve itself has moved to the left or to the right. If it moves to the right, it is increasing. If it moves to the left, it is decreasing. So if I say that there is an increase in quantity demanded, then I'm referring to a movement along the curve. This is a movement along the curve. How does it look? As the price goes up, quantity demanded falls. Again, typically economists like to write it quantity demanded as Q subscript D. Here my price is rising and my quantity demanded is falling. That is again referred to as a movement along the curve, or a change in quantity demanded. But what we're referring to here is what happens when that's my demand curve, and now it's way out here. How did this happen? Right, because now we're saying that not quantity demanded increased. Here we're saying that actually demand increased. So the question then is, how do we increase demand? What do we have to do to increase demand? So again, how does it look? That's what this is telling us. Here's my increase. There's my decrease. Well, what shifts the curve is any one of these 5 things. Income, the price of related goods, tastes, expectations, and the number of buyers. And we're going to basically look at all 5 of these things. Let's start with income. Well, let's also go back here. For each of these, what we're looking at here is with each of these, how does the demand curve shift when one of these 5 things change? So that's what we're going to look at here. So let's start with a income, when income changes. So it's not always going to be the case that people buy more of the product when income increases. One way to think about this would be that most goods are what we would call normal goods. And what that means is that when my income goes up, I buy more. Not too surprising, right? I mean, this is just what I do, with this product. I buy more of it because my income is going up. It also would mean that if my income goes down, I buy less. So examples would be things like shoes, cars, boats, books, electronics, houses, any number of things here. It's the case that if I all of a sudden became a famous actor, I probably would buy more houses and more cars and more shoes. And if I lost my job as an actor and now am without a job, I will probably sell my houses, meaning get rid of them. I'll decrease my demand. But there's actually a set of goods that are also inferior goods. It's not very large, but there's a number of goods out there where when your income goes up, you actually have a decrease in demand. So like a great example of that is the bus, right? I mean, yeah, it's great to be environmentally conscious, but right, I mean, the bus is also inconvenient, right? It can be. It can be crowded, and during COVID, that could certainly be dangerous. But it also could be dangerous, right? Because you don't really know the people that you're on the bus with. If you have some kind of disability, riding the bus can be made even more difficult. Um, you can't go and buy a whole bunch of stuff at Costco and then get on the bus. So you have some lack of access to like storage space. So usually, right, if I had no job and then all of a sudden I got a job, I probably would buy I probably would buy um, a car to drive in. Okay, I'm gonna pause the video here for 1 second. Okay, let's go back here. So the bus would be an example of an inferior good. You know how like Target's got that like brand that they have, of the same products, like what's it called? Like I think it's like called Up and Up, right? I mean, like rich people don't buy Up and Up, right? It's people who, are making right, sacrifices, right? Am I gonna buy diapers for my kid or pay the rent, right? If you need to be able to do both, you might buy the Up and Up diapers, even though they're not as great. In this case, you have the same event happening, income going up, but now the demand curve moves in the opposite direction. Show what this looks like. That would mean that if I tell you that income goes up, and that's the only thing I tell you, you don't know how the demand curve is going to shift. And the reason why you don't is because you need to know whether the product is normal or inferior. If it's normal, demand increases. If it's inferior, demand decreases. And the way that would look is if it's normal, my demand curve would shift out. If it's inferior, then my demand would decrease. So now let's look at, and I should say too, if it goes in the opposite direction, that income is falling, then demand will decrease if it's normal and will increase if it's inferior. So it also moves in the opposite direction. So what about related goods? Now this is factor number 2. Income was factor number 1. Now let's look at related goods. There's 2 kinds of relationships that exist. Prices could be substitutes or they could be complements. Or I guess the third option would be is they have no relationship at all to each other. If the products are substitutes, then what that means is that they fulfill a similar need. Coke and Pepsi are substitute goods, right? If you love cola, either one will probably make you happy. Cars and SUVs are substitute goods, meaning I use one or I probably use the other. I don't know, limes and lemons, they kind of taste the same, right? And so if the recipe calls for a lime and you have no limes, maybe you could use a lemon and it wouldn't be that weird. Now, what this means is that if that kind of relationship exists, then increasing the price of the one good increases the demand for the other. Let's show that why that's the case. So here we're saying that if it's a substitute, increasing the price of cars increases the demand for SUVs. So what do we know is going to happen here? In the car market, we know that, so Q is always standing for quantity, P is always standing for price. Here's my demand curve. And I'm saying here, I'm going to increase the price. So the price is going to go up. So I'm going to move along the demand curve in the car market. But now in the SUV market, which is right here, the change now is going to be represented by this. Now, the reason why it looks like that for the SUV market is first, nothing happened to the price for SUVs. But also what's happening here is that fewer people are buying a car because cars are getting more expensive. So then people would say, why am I buying this even more expensive car when I could just have a big SUV? So they shift their purchasing to the substitute good. And so the substitute exists between cars and SUVs. That's the nature of the relationship between these two products. These two products have a relationship with each other. And that is that they substitute for one another. Not for nothing, but this is one of the things that's often done in a marketing campaign is that you try to say that your product is not a substitute for another. Remember how I talked about like that Up and Up brand of diapers? So, you can like look on the internet and try to find out what company they use to make those diapers. But there's really two major diaper companies out there, Pampers and Huggies. Everything else is kind of like a smaller market, or just not as many people buy those. So it's either Pampers or Huggies. But if you're anything like me, like when I had my very first child, I bought Pampers. Pampers are like the most expensive. Well, by number 2, I was already buying Kirkland, the Costco brand of diapers. And what's interesting is that you can find out who makes those diapers. It's actually Huggies. So Huggies makes them. They don't look exactly like Huggies diapers, but they're pretty darn close. But on the box, on the Kirkland box, it even says like, we don't, they don't advertise that Huggies makes them. And if you look at, like, as another example, like mouthwash, like Listerine, like, which is the name brand, there's even like a label on the Listerine that says, we don't sell our formula to anyone else, right? And then right next to it on the shelf is the Up and Up brand. What they're trying to do, Listerine, what they're trying to do through marketing and communication is they don't want you to think of Listerine and Up and Up mouthwash as substitutes for one another, because Listerine doesn't want to raise its price and you start buying the Up and Up brand. They don't want you to think it's a substitute, because if you just like the Listerine formula, we don't want, right, if we're Listerine, we don't want you to start buying Up and Up. And maybe you won't, because you'll think this is the only place you can get that formula from. So then our other relationship is that they could be complements with one another. This is then saying that you increase the price of the one and you decrease the demand for another. When goods are a complement, they're basically used together. Keyboard and a mouse. Meat and potatoes. French fries and hamburgers. Left shoes and right shoes, right? Unless you're a pirate, right, you're probably going to buy a left shoe and a right shoe. Increasing the price of the one good is actually going to decrease the demand for the other. Let's look at how that works. So because of their relationship of what a complement is, increasing the price of the one good decreases the demand of the other. Let's look at how that works. So let's say this is left shoe. Let's say this is right shoe. Increasing the price of the left shoe causes quantity demanded of left shoes to fall. How do we know that? We know that because of the law of demand, which says that P and Q move in the opposite direction. How that looks graphically is that in the left shoe market. In the right shoe market, though, now and this is important what I'm saying here right now. In the left shoe market, the price went up, so fewer people are buying a left shoe. Let's just say shoes are sold separately. Left shoes are sold separately from right shoes. If the price of left shoes goes up, fewer people will buy left shoes. But in the right shoe market, I didn't change the price of right shoes, but the thing they buy with right shoes, which are left shoes, have gone up in price. So the result of that is that the demand for right shoes is going to fall, because now they're not buying left shoes because the price went up. So then why would you need a right shoe? These are all put on the same page, so they're pretty easy here. It's number 3, number 4, number 5. These don't have to really be drawn out for you. Basically, what they mean is that why would my taste for a product change? Well, look at face masks, right? A year and a half ago, who would buy a face mask? Very, very few people would. But then all of a sudden you tell people, hey, there's a global deadly pandemic going around. Then people will be like, oh my God, I really think I want to cover my mouth and nose so that others don't get me sick. Our tastes change. And if our taste for that item improve, the demand increases. Now it can go in the opposite direction. If a study comes out and says that drinking soda will make you die years earlier, then we would imagine that you would have decreased taste for that product and that your demand for that product would fall. Another factor that affects the demand curve are my expectations about the future. If I expect in the future prices to be higher, then I'm going to buy stuff now and jump up ahead of this. If I expect my income to increase, I might buy more now because I know that in the future I'm going to have enough money to pay it off. And then the final factor is how many buyers are out there. And if my number of buyers increases, my demand curve increases and more people buying stuff. And so here we go. This, you should commit this chart to your memory. When you're getting ready to take the exam, have this slide out. But basically, if I change the price of the good itself, that's where I move along the curve. Any of these other things are all shifting the curve. And they only shift in one of two directions. Either they increase or decrease demand. You are going to want to be familiar with which way the demand curve shifts based on which way these variables are moving. Okay, I'm not going to really cover this case study because that's not really the point of this course. You can read it. I mean, I'm not stopping you from reading it. But one of the key concepts then that we covered here, and this is important for this first video, is again, there's a difference between shifting the demand curve, which we represent as that, versus quantity demanded increasing or decreasing. And that's caused by movement. Movement is always a change in the price of the product. This triangle just means change in delta. It's a change in the price of the product. The shift that's if something happened, like tastes, like price of related goods, etc., etc. And again, they look different. This is our shift. This would be a decrease. And this would be a change in the quantity demanded. Also a decrease. But notice how they look different. Well, I can't show you that because you'd be unhappy. But they do look different, obviously. This is a decrease in demand. This is a decrease in the quantity demanded. I absolutely guarantee you this will be on the exam, shifts and movements. Okay, that ends this first video, which covered markets in general and the demand curve.